welcome back. In this video, we're going to focus on strategy. Before we go into and really understand and before I communicate what we learned from the very best and top agencies, first we need to understand a couple of concepts that emerged from the research. I want to merge a couple of things that we talked about in the last video. We talked about this polarization of differentiation, and we talked about how there's two major variables or two major ways that people differentiate, and that's appeal and that's complexity. Now, I want to do something here. If we take the appeal spectrum and we put that down, and then we take the complexity spectrum and we put that over that, what we find is that we've created a graph, we've created a chart. And interestingly enough, what you'll find is that there becomes 4 quadrants in that. These 4 quadrants become extremely important as we continue through our conversations in this video series, not just in strategy, but across marketing, sales, execution, and culture. So please make sure that you really got this. And if you don't, please reach out to me, okay? Now, let's dive into each one of these. Let's take a look at number 1 first. Number 1 is high complexity, but mass appeal. Have you heard of ProNICA? ProNICA is a group that specializes in student delegations to Nicaragua. The interesting thing about what they do there, though, is that they let everything be customized outside of that 2-week time frame. So you can customize the cultural events that you're going to experience, the lectures that you're going to have, the speakers that you're going to have. They offer a variety of social events that you can attend. You can pick from a whole different group of that. It's almost like this buffet. Now, when you look at that and you look at how they've made this very complex piece of travel very open and very mass in its appeal, is that they've done that by simplifying the complexity, by putting processes in place and systems in place and relationships in place that enable that customization to go through without a hitch. That's why we've called this quadrant the simplified quadrant. Now, if we go to the other side of the spectrum, we look at high complexity with niche appeal, we see different agencies and different opportunities like those presented by Vision 2000. Vision 2000 has a program which takes people that enjoy singing, and they take them, whether they're a group or whether they're a group of individuals that all happen to be interested in the same type of music, and they pair them with a choir master. And what they do is they build these custom itineraries where, let's say, we're interested as a group to go to France and to understand the evolution of French music. They may go to Marseille and they may go to Paris, and along the way, they're going to practice as a group with the choir master in the song and within the music of that region. Now, what they'll do then along the way is not just practice, but then see different sites and connect as a group. And this all culminates, all of this time together, in a final formal performance that they do for that community. Now, when you think about that, there's only a specific group of people that are going to really want to do that. It's very targeted. And if you look at that, it's also a lot of complexity involved. And that's why we've called this quadrant the expertise quadrant. Targeted and complex. Let's move to the bottom quadrant. The bottom quadrant is all about niche appeal, but low complexity. In this, we'll find groups like Ski.com. Ski.com focuses and boasts that they can offer the very best in skiing and mountain conditions in North America, in South America, and in Europe. Now, the interesting thing about Ski.com, though, is that with that offering, how many people do you see that can offer these ski trips and these ski destinations? Because of that complexity, it actually brings in more competition. And we'll talk about that later. But what they've really done is they've taken a mass group and they've sliced away at it. And so they found different segments that they liked. In this case with Ski.com, it's the people that enjoy winter sports, whether it be skiing, snowboarding, snowshoeing, whatever that may be. It's a segmented group, and that's why we call that quadrant the segmented quadrant. Let's go to the other side. Now, the other side, when we look at this space, this is where you're going to see the Expedias and the Priceline and the Travelocities, all of those big players. What do they focus on? Mass appeal and low complex work. And we've called that the volume quadrant. Now, I don't want you to misinterpret this when we say volume. Volume doesn't necessarily mean sheer scale, because you can actually hit volume and scale in any one of these quadrants. But in here, that's what they focus on. That's their core. Their core is doing lots of transactions. cycling through a lot of business. Okay. Now, why is this important? Let's take a look at this and let's understand this and make sure and check our understanding. Let's look at some examples. So the first example, where would you see a river cruise on the Danube going on this chart? Take a moment and ask yourself that and plot that within your workbook. Now, when we were looking at this, and again, it's all based on interpretation. Okay, so based on all of those variables that we talked about, the 6 for complexity and the 6 for appeal, we could argue just about any space on here. But when we started to look at it, we thought that it probably belonged in the simplified quadrant. Now, Europe's a bit more accessible. Cruises are typically a little bit more, they're a bit less daunting for people, is what we see. And because of that, we saw it move from the expertise into that simplified quadrant. What about group modern art tours in France? Where do you think that would go? We thought that that would be definitely in the expertise quadrant. It's a group. Now, I know it doesn't specify if it's 3 or 300. That makes a difference, but let's go with 300. It's also modern art. It's a specific type of art. And it's also in France, meaning there might be multiple destinations involved. How about excursions through Africa? Where would you see that on that chart? We saw it also in the expertise quadrant. Now, why did we say that that was high complexity but still sort of niche? Is because for a lot of people it might still be a little bit too unobtainable. There's a lot involved. There's visas involved. There's passports involved. There's potentially shots that you need. If you're going on safari, you may have to convince your wife that she's not going to get eaten by a lion. There's a lot that you need to do there. Let's look at call centers. It could be corporate or it could be leisure related. Where do you see that? I think that one's a no-brainer. That's going to be much more volume oriented. What we saw in the agencies that we worked with is that was very transactional. It was get the phone, understand what they're looking for, get the payment, get on to the next person quite often. What about spring breakers? Where do you think spring breakers go? We thought that they went into the segmented quadrant. With that group, it's pretty much if you can give a co-ed environment with alcohol involved, you're going to be successful in that quadrant. To preserve the integrity of the rest of this video series, we won't elaborate on that any further. But as you can see, they've taken something that's mass and they're likely carving that out into specific niches, whether it be a party cruise, whether it be a specific location in Mexico, whatever that may be. So how many of you say, you know what? I probably do just about all of these. What we found is that outside of maybe the call center, that's what many people said. Now, when you look at all of these examples that we've gone through, what you'll see is that those are types of trips. But you're an agency. You're 30,000 foot. That's on the ground. So when you think about your agency and where you might sit, you got to look at all of these different options that you're offering, all of the different products and services that you're putting out there, all of those destinations that you're serving. And when you do that, where do you think that you would fit? Based on this example here, we thought that you're probably somewhere right around the middle of the spectrum. Now, I want you to stop for a second, and I want you to think about those 12 variables and think about all of the different offerings and all of the different things that you do within each one of those variables. Take some time to do that. Take the hour that it may take to really do it and be thorough in that. And the reason for that is that that will help you understand where you see yourself today as an agency. Now, with the slide that I have up now, here's just an example that we found from one of our agencies that we went out and that we spoke with. You'll see that we only took 3 variables from each one, but you can potentially use this and pause it here to really get some insight as to how you might want to be thinking about these things. I would also say that this is at too high of a level. You're going to want to be a lot more specific, but after you've spent that time, plot yourself on that chart and see where you are. Now, we also spent time within the executive retreats this past year in both the US and Canada asking this same question to agencies. We asked them to come up to the front of the room and to plot where they felt that they were. So let's take a quick moment and see how that turned out. When we look at the US exec retreat, what do you see? You see people were a bit more gravitated towards the expertise side. But what do you see? You see this sort of critical mass around the center, okay? Weighted towards expertise, but still in the center. Now let's look at what we saw in the Canadian executive retreat. So when we looked at Canada, it was very similar. You'll see the critical mass had moved a little bit, and actually you can't even see many of the dots here because they're overlapping. A lot of people put themselves exactly in the center of this chart. Now, I want to show you something. We spent time as a team, and we really sat down and we said, qualitatively, where do we see the agencies that we've been speaking with? Where do we see other agencies within Ensemble that we haven't talked to? And where do we see other agencies that aren't part of the Ensemble network? Now, again, it's very rough, it's qualitative, and again, any type of variable changes may impact the way that you see that. But let's take a look at this. What do you see here? The critical mass is in the center. Now, everyone is gravitating towards that middle space. Not quite mass appeal, not quite niche. We do a little bit of both probably. Not quite high complexity, not quite low complexity. We're somewhere in the middle. You see a shift, or you see a culmination of them within this volume quadrant. And I think that speaks to some of the other topics that we've spoke to around being forced towards volume and forced towards doing more business with more customers based on this polarization of differentiation and these eroding margins. Now, you need to ask yourself, why is that important? Well, when we sat down as a team and we looked at the research, we found a couple of different areas or a couple of different themes that emerged. The first theme that came forward was this idea and this notion of the red zone. Let me describe the red zone to you. The red zone has 4 distinguishing factors. So agencies that were in this red zone, or how I would articulate the red zone, is first, imprecision. There's just a lack of clarity. Who do I want to be? What do I want to do? Where do I want this agency to go? Now, the next piece of it was in this red zone, there's this squeezing motion. And the reason why I say squeeze is that with all of these eroding commissions, people are they're looking around trying to find where is that money going to come from. And then there's also this feeling of being trapped. In the red zone, what you'll find is that there's more competition than ever, not from just these big technology players, but also because of the internet, you're no longer competing with the person who has the storefront down the street from you. You may be competing with someone that's all the way across the world for that same dollar. What you'll also notice in this slide is that within each of these zones, the size of the red zone is different. The magnitude is different. And there's reasons for that. The reasons are that in certain areas, it's easier, the point of entry is easier. So for instance, with the enablement of technology, it's almost every day that you're finding a new technology player within the travel and leisure market. Look at who you see entering that space. You see Microsoft with Bing. You see Google now in that space. You've got Expedia and Travelocity and Kayak and Priceline. There's lots of churn. And that's why in the volume quadrant, you see it being actually quite extensive as the red zone. In other spaces, it's smaller because it's much more difficult. It's very difficult from a technology perspective to handle that complexity or to be extremely targeted. So that's why you're seeing in the expertise quadrant, it's so small and it's shrunk. So why is this a problem? What do we see in the red zone? Well, let's take the red zone and then let's overlap where that previous screen was, where all of the agencies were located. What do you find in this? It's a bit alarming. What you find is that the vast majority of agencies that we were looking at find themselves within the red zone. Now, you could look at this as sort of this doom and gloom situation, but in reality, there's actually just a lot of opportunity. Now, we'll explain this as we go. In many cases, it was simply, I just haven't put the right pieces in place to pull myself out of that. But we're already doing a lot of the things that we need to do. Now, this brings us to another theme or another emerging concept that came out of this research. That was the notion of creep. Now, ladies, this isn't a reference to maybe a past boyfriend that you've had. This is actually this notion that the red zone is always constantly growing. Why is it growing? New technology is constantly coming into play. Relationships are being formed. You're getting brands that are lodging themselves in the mind of the buyer, your buyer. You're also seeing more entry. There's maybe more people opening up new travel agencies. It's not just these big players again. It could be just another agency similar size to you that wants to serve the same customers. Naturally, if you have a red zone or you have an area that you want to pull yourself out of, there's also what we call the differentiation zone. Now, the important thing here is that the differentiation zone is not a safe zone. The concept here is that your agency and the things that you do have some buoyancy to them. You can move on this freely, and it can change almost from quarter to quarter, month to month, day to day. The important thing is that you're resonating, or that you're finding yourself doing more in the quadrant that you want to be in. If you want to be in a certain quadrant, let's say expertise, then you're doing much more high complex travel. You're doing much more very targeted travel, maybe lots more of groups that want specific things. But that brings us to the fact that you need to be thoughtful and you need to be deliberate on understanding where are you going to compete. If you're going to compete in Simplified, then you better be investing in the processes and the systems and in all of the things that you need in order to simplify the experience and bring it from niche to mass. If it's segmented, then you better be very good at carving out markets, being able to exploit that opportunity, then move on to the next thing, because it's going to be replicated fairly quickly. So stop for a moment and you think about that. If you know where you are today based on the previous exercise, where do you want to be? That's an important question to answer. Now, here's what we saw from the research. We've talked about all these things. We've talked about eroding supplier commissions. We've talked about massive competition. We've talked about technology disruption. But there's also a lot of things that are still at play. There's also lots of complexity in travel. There's managing the end-to-end and the time that takes. It's knowing what the options are. Some people, you don't know what you don't know. And then there's also just having confidence in the final choice that you've made. I'll give you an example to this. Recently, Dr. Michael Young from Southern Illinois University did a study on how often or how long does it take to plan a trip for the average person. And here's what he found. He found that the average person looking to travel visits 21 sites over 9 sessions. You're telling me that you couldn't simplify that experience? Huge opportunity there, and that's just one basic example. But the thing of it is that what we found in the research is that a lot of agencies that were being successful, they had gravitated themselves based on these things. They've solved these problems by moving into the expertise quadrant. And up there, what they found is that they're actually already doing all of these things. They just had to figure it out and how to make it run like a fine-tuned engine. What they did is they realized we're investing in the training. We're already getting lots of product and service knowledge from our suppliers. I'm also sending people on these trips to go gather and gain experience in all the destinations and the activities that we serve. I'm also really embedding technology such as a CRM system to really understand my customer better than I ever have before. And all of that is typical when you look at the expertise quadrant. It's just about making it come together. Now, here's another thing that we found. Even those agencies that, let's say, were playing in the volume quadrant, that regardless of that, all of their independent agents, whether they were external to them or internal as part of their business, still had to compete based on their knowledge and based on their expertise. So no matter who you are, what you do, you're always going to compete based on what you know. So let's summarize what we've learned here. We learned about the 4 quadrants. We learned about the simplified quadrant, the expertise quadrant, the segmented quadrant, and the volume quadrant. We talked about and gave some examples of what it meant to be there and who's playing there. We then talked about these new themes that have emerged, including the red zone and creep and the differentiation zone. And we looked at how agencies are currently stuck in these, how there's this lack of precision. We've talked about how there's this feeling of being squeezed with commissions and margins, about how I feel trapped, I'm stuck in this space. And we finalize this with the fact that you need to make a strategic choice. What quadrant do you want to be the one that you play in with the vast majority of your business? And really, we talked about once you make that decision, that no matter what, you're always going to have to compete based on what you know and the expertise that you provide. That all came directly from you and from the research. With that, in the future videos, we'll be talking a little bit more about how the best agencies have really embraced this concept and have changed their strategy to really, truly extract the most value that they possibly could out of this. Thank you. I look forward to talking to you on the next video.